They tried to destroy him. They tried to poison him. But Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, stood strong. This is the story of how a young leader fought betrayal, defied the African Union, and exposed the truth about Africa's corrupt leaders. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso had become a symbol of hope for many across Africa. Since he took office, his leadership had breathed new life into the country. The people had long been deprived of dignity and respect under corrupt regimes. But with Ibrahim in charge, things were changing. The streets of Ouagadougou, the capital, were alive with energy. As people saw their lives improving, they were finally able to trust their government, which was cracking down on corruption, providing electricity, and ensuring that the wealth of the country stayed in the hands of the people. But as his popularity grew, so did the fear from those in power across the continent. Ibrahim Traoré's rise had unsettled many of Africa's older leaders, those who had been in power for decades, those who had long been linked with foreign interests and corrupt deals. Among them were Alassane Ouattara of Ivory Coast and Bola Tinubu of Nigeria, both of whom had long held power in their respective countries. They saw Ibrahim's rising popularity as a direct threat to their regimes. They feared that the young dynamic president could inspire revolutions in their own countries, particularly among the youth, who were growing disillusioned with the status quo. But it wasn't just the leaders of these countries that were concerned. The African Union AU, which was supposed to represent the unity of the African continent, began to turn against him. Despite Ibrahim's strong support from the people of Burkina Faso and many young Africans, the AU issued a shocking statement. Ibrahim Traoré was not invited to the annual AU summit, and there were even threats to expel him from the union altogether. The reason: they called him a bloodthirsty dictator, claiming that his leadership was too dangerous for the stability of the continent. This statement, which came out of nowhere, was backed by Ouattara and Tinubu. They feared that Ibrahim's example of standing up to the West and rejecting foreign influence might spark a wave of change that they couldn't control. The AU's attack on Ibrahim was an attempt to silence a leader who was seen as a challenge to the old corrupt political order in Africa. The people of Burkina Faso were livid when they heard the news. They saw it for what it was: another attempt by foreign-controlled African leaders to protect their positions. The AU was not acting in the interest of the people, but in the interest of politicians who served foreign powers. The African people, already fed up with corrupt leadership, now saw the AU as another institution working against their future. They didn't need a union that supported corruption and exploitation. They needed leaders who would stand up for them, like Ibrahim. Ibrahim Traoré, however, was not afraid. When he heard the news about the AU's statement, he was unfazed. He wasn't interested in the approval of corrupt politicians who served the interests of the West. He had been elected to serve the people of Burkina Faso, and he would not back down. Ibrahim had already made it clear that his leadership would be about justice, dignity, and sovereignty for Africa, no matter what the international community thought. In a public speech, he dismissed the AU's statement, calling them what they were: corrupt politicians who follow orders. "The African Union cannot tell me how to lead my country." Ibrahim said, his voice steady and resolute. "These so-called leaders are more concerned with protecting their own power than with serving the people. I do not need their invitation to speak for my people." The people of Burkina Faso erupted with cheers. Ibrahim Traoré had become their hero, the man who would not bend to foreign powers, the man who had stood up for his country's dignity. It wasn't just about one man. It was about Africa's fight to reclaim its future. The news of Ibrahim's defiance spread quickly across the continent, and the reactions were mixed. In the Ivory Coast and Nigeria, Ouattara and Tinubu's supporters rallied behind them. while in other countries, particularly among the youth, Ibrahim's boldness inspired hope. The African Union had shown its true colors, and Ibrahim Traoré had exposed it for the world to see. He had made it clear that no foreign power would control Africa's destiny any longer. With his words, Ibrahim Traoré had ignited something powerful in the hearts of the African people. They had been waiting for a leader who would stand up against the old systems of corruption, who would fight for Africa's sovereignty, and who would give them the voice they deserved. And now they had it. The news of Ibrahim Traoré's defiance against the African Union spread like wildfire across the continent. In Burkina Faso, the people were energized. They saw their president not only fighting for the country, but also standing up to the corrupt elites who had long kept Africa in chains. The streets of Ouagadougou were filled with chants of support for their president. He had become a symbol of defiance, someone who wasn't afraid to expose the truth and challenge the political systems that had failed them for so long. But not everyone shared the same sentiment. In Ivory Coast, President Alassane Ouattara and his supporters were furious. They viewed Ibrahim's rejection of the AU's decision as a direct challenge to their authority. Ouattara, who had long been known as a leader who supported Western interests, feared the rise of leaders like Ibrahim, who rejected the status quo. He knew that if Ibrahim's example spread to other countries, it could spark a wave of revolution that would overthrow regimes built on corruption and foreign control. The situation in Nigeria wasn't much different. President Bola Tinubu, another leader who had close ties to Western powers, was deeply concerned about the growing influence of Ibrahim Traoré. Tinubu saw the rise of the young Burkinabe leader as a threat to his own power. The people in Nigeria, particularly the youth, had already started to speak out against corruption, and Ibrahim's leadership was a beacon of hope for those who wanted change. Tinubu feared that Ibrahim's popularity would lead to mass uprisings in his own country. Back in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim was resolute. His dismissal of the African Union's statement had caused ripples throughout the political world, but it had also solidified his position as the people's leader. He wasn't just defending his presidency. He was defending the idea that African nations should govern themselves without interference from foreign powers or corrupt politicians within their own ranks. Despite the public support, Ibrahim knew that the enemies of progress wouldn't back down easily. The African Union's threats to expel him were just the beginning. He understood the political games being played behind the scenes. In his heart, he knew the struggle was far from over. Burkina Faso's success under his leadership had made it a target, and those who feared the spread of his revolutionary ideas would stop at nothing to bring him down. However, Ibrahim had made his position clear. He would not be intimidated by the old guard of African politics. The people of Burkina Faso were ready to defend their country and their president. Ibrahim's message was simple and powerful. No African leader would bow to the whims of the West any longer. In a public address, he spoke directly to the African people. They want to silence us, to push us back into the darkness of corruption and exploitation. But we are not afraid. We will not go back. The time for change has come. It's time for Africa to speak for itself. We will rise, and we will stand together. His words were met with thunderous applause. It was clear that Ibrahim's boldness had won him not just the hearts of the Burkinabe people, but the respect of many Africans who were tired of the old political systems. Young people across the continent began to rally behind him, believing that his fight for justice and equality could ignite a movement that would reshape Africa's future. The African Union, sensing the growing support for Ibrahim, tried to backtrack, but the damage had already been done. The truth had been revealed. The AU, led by corrupt leaders like Ouattara and Tinubu, was no longer a symbol of unity. It had become a tool of control, manipulated by those who cared more about their power than the people they were supposed to serve. Ibrahim's stand had exposed the weakness and hypocrisy of the AU. The people were no longer blind to the corruption that ran deep within the Union. But while the people of Burkina Faso and many Africans celebrated Ibrahim's defiance, there were still those in power who were determined to bring him down. The West, led by France and other European powers, was watching closely. They had invested heavily in maintaining control over African resources, and Ibrahim's anti-corruption policies and rejection of foreign influence threatened their interests. Behind closed doors, discussions were already taking place on how to neutralize the young leader. Ibrahim, however, was no fool. He knew that these forces would not back down without a fight. They had already tried to kill him once through a poisoned plot orchestrated by his sister-in-law. But Ibrahim had survived that attempt, and he knew that they would try again, using whatever means necessary. Despite the threats, Ibrahim stood firm. He trusted in the people of Burkina Faso, and he knew that as long as they were united, no force could defeat them. Meanwhile, across the continent, the conversation about Ibrahim's leadership had started to change. No longer was he just the president of Burkina Faso. He had become a symbol of resistance, a leader who stood up to the old powers that had kept Africa under their control for so long. And as more people began to recognize the power of the revolution he had started, it became clear that his influence was spreading. What had started as a fight for Burkina Faso's dignity had evolved into a movement for African sovereignty, one that would echo across the continent and beyond. In the quiet of his office, Ibrahim Traoré sat staring at the map of Africa on the wall. He knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that there was no turning back. The people of Burkina Faso had given him their trust, and he would not betray them. The revolution for Africa's freedom had begun, and Ibrahim Traoré would be at its helm, leading the charge for the future of the continent. As the days passed, the tension surrounding Ibrahim Traoré's defiance against the African Union grew. The people of Burkina Faso stood united, their pride in their president swelling with each passing moment. But for Ibrahim, the pressure was building from all sides. The African Union had already issued its threats, but it was the powerful countries behind them, France and other Western nations, that truly worried him. Their influence could easily destabilize not only his presidency, but the future of Burkina Faso. Ibrahim's advisors, the trusted men and women who had stood with him from the beginning, were concerned. "We know their tactics," one of them said. "They'll try to use any means to weaken your position. We must be prepared for what's coming." Despite the warnings, Ibrahim remained resolute. He refused to be intimidated. His victory was not just personal. It was a victory for the entire continent. He knew that if Burkina Faso could hold its ground, it could inspire the rest of Africa. But he also understood the danger. The forces that wanted to see him removed were not just political. They were deep, powerful, and far-reaching. Meanwhile, across the border in Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara and Bola Tinubu were making moves. The two leaders, fearful of Ibrahim's rising influence, began quietly orchestrating a campaign to isolate him further. They lobbied with the African Union, arguing that Burkina Faso's leadership was too radical and too dangerous for the stability of the continent. They painted Ibrahim as a dictator, a man who was a threat to peace and unity. But Ibrahim wasn't worried about their campaign. He was focused on the people, his people, the ones who had supported him, who believed in his vision of a strong, independent Africa. He knew the real struggle lay not in the halls of the African Union, but on the streets of Ouagadougou, in the hearts of his citizens. He would not let them down. I don't need their approval, Ibrahim told his inner circle one evening, his voice calm but firm. The people of Burkina Faso have chosen me, and they know the truth. We cannot be bought or threatened by anyone. We are free. That night, Ibrahim addressed the nation. The air was heavy with anticipation, but there was no fear in his words. The African Union may try to silence us. He began speaking with the weight of a leader who had seen the depths of betrayal. They may call me a dictator, but they cannot silence the voice of the people. We will not bow to their corrupt systems. We will not give in to their lies. We are building a new future for Burkina Faso and for Africa. And no matter how hard they try, no matter how much they threaten us, we will stand tall. His words were met with roaring applause. The people were behind him, their spirits lifted by his courage. The movement was growing. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just the president of Burkina Faso. He had become a symbol for all of Africa. The young people especially saw in him the hope they had long been denied. They were tired of watching their countries suffer under the control of foreign powers and corrupt politicians. They were ready to stand with Ibrahim, ready to fight for an Africa that was truly free. But while the people of Burkina Faso were celebrating their president's strength, not all was well behind the scenes. Ibrahim knew that the political and military pressure was mounting. The enemies he had made in the African Union and beyond weren't going to give up easily. Even as the people rallied around him, Ibrahim began to see signs that the stakes were much higher than he had anticipated. Late one night, Ibrahim received a message from an anonymous source. The message was simple but chilling. "They're coming for you." The sender didn't specify who they were, but Ibrahim knew what it meant. His enemies were closing in. They had already tried to poison him, and now they were planning something bigger. He couldn't let his guard down. The following days were filled with strategic meetings and preparations. Ibrahim doubled down on his security. He knew that the threat against him wasn't just about personal danger. It was about keeping the revolution alive. His people had trusted him, and he wouldn't let them down. But as the pressure from outside forces increased, so did the resolve of Burkina Faso's citizens. More and more people from across Africa began to reach out, offering their support. Ibrahim's message was spreading beyond the borders of his country. The world began to take notice. What had started as a battle for Burkina Faso's independence was now being seen as a symbol for the entire continent. Ibrahim Traoré had become the leader of a movement, a man who had defied the odds, faced betrayal, and stood firm in the face of immense pressure. His fight was not just for one country. It was for Africa's dignity, Africa's freedom, and the future of its people. But Ibrahim knew that the battle was far from over. The forces working against him were not just external. They were internal too. His own allies had begun to question his methods, his vision. Some of his closest military leaders were unsure of the path he had chosen. Could he really continue to hold the line against both internal corruption and foreign threats? But Ibrahim had made a promise to the people of Burkina Faso. He would not stop until they had the future they deserved. He would face whatever challenges came his way, whether they came from foreign enemies, corrupt politicians, or even those within his own government. The path ahead was uncertain, but Ibrahim Traoré's resolve was unshaken. He had already shown the world what a leader could do when he refused to be bought or silenced. Now, it was time to show the world what Burkina Faso and Africa too could do when they stood together united and strong. The following days were filled with a heavy tension as Ibrahim Traoré prepared for what he knew would be the next phase in his fight. He was under no illusion that the pressure on Burkina Faso would ease. The coup attempt against him had failed, but his enemies, those who feared the revolution he had sparked, were regrouping quietly, pulling strings behind the scenes. The whispers of foreign intervention grew louder, and the political maneuvering intensified. His own allies, the ones who had supported him when he first rose to power, now began to question his decisions. As Ibrahim sat in his office late one evening, the door opened quietly, and General Traoré, one of his trusted commanders, entered. There was a grave look on his face, one Ibrahim had seen before, in moments of crisis. President Traoré began, his voice low. There are rumors circulating. The African Union is making new threats. This time they're pushing for an economic blockade against Burkina Faso. It's not just talk anymore. They're gathering support from other African nations. Ibrahim listened carefully, his face unwavering. He had expected this. The AU's leadership had shown its true colors, but now they were stepping up their game. The economic power of the African Union was not to be taken lightly, and a blockade could hurt Burkina Faso's growth. But Ibrahim's response was calm. Let them try, he said quietly. If they want to bring us down, they will have to do more than talk. Burkina Faso has always been a land of resilience. If they think they can break us through their threats, they will learn how strong we are. General Traoré nodded clearly, not as confident as his president. But he trusted Ibrahim. There's also something else, Traoré said, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Some of your closest advisors are starting to lose confidence. There are whispers about your strict policies, particularly the law, that politicians can't transfer money out of the country. They say it's too harsh, that it will drive people away. Ibrahim leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. He had anticipated internal resistance. After all, his reforms were shaking the very foundations of a corrupt system that had thrived for decades. But he knew the people of Burkina Faso were behind him, and as long as they remained united, nothing could stop their progress. Those who fear change are the ones who will try to tear us down, Ibrahim said firmly. But the law is not negotiable. We will not allow our resources to be stolen and sent elsewhere while our people suffer. If they do not support the revolution, they will be exposed. The tension in the room was palpable, but Ibrahim's voice remained unwavering. He had already made up his mind. His commitment to the people of Burkina Faso was clear. There was no turning back. That night, as Ibrahim walked through the quiet streets of Ouagadougou, he could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. The country was in turmoil, and the battle for Africa's future was being fought right here in his homeland. But as he passed the crowded markets and the bustling neighborhoods, he saw the faces of the people, faces full of hope, determination, and pride. They believed in him, and that belief gave him strength. In the days that followed, Ibrahim went ahead with a bold move. He called a national broadcast, addressing not only the people of Burkina Faso, but the entire African continent. His voice echoed through the airwaves as he spoke to the hearts of millions. My people, I stand before you, not as a leader who seeks power, but as a man who seeks justice for all. The corrupt systems that have held us down for so long will no longer control us. I will not allow foreign powers or corrupt politicians to dictate our future. Burkina Faso will not be their pawn. He continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I know they fear us because we are standing for what is right. The revolution is not just for Burkina Faso. It is for every African who has been oppressed, exploited, and ignored for centuries. We will rise together, united in our fight for dignity or for freedoms, and for a future that belongs to us, not to those who seek to control us. The response was immediate. People flooded the streets in support of their president. In every city, from the smallest villages to the largest towns, the people of Burkina Faso showed up in droves, chanting Ibrahim's name. They were no longer just supporting a leader. They were supporting a movement, a cause that transcended borders and politics. Ibrahim Traoré had become the face of the African Revolution. The message was clear. Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim's leadership, would not back down. The people stood with him, and the movement was growing. From the streets of Ouagadougou to the villages in the countryside, the people were ready to fight for their future. It was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about all of Africa united in the struggle for sovereignty. But even as Ibrahim's message resonated across the continent, there were those who sought to silence him. Ouattara and Tinubu, unable to break his resolve, turned to more dangerous tactics. The international media began to attack his reputation, portraying him as a threat to the stability of the region. They painted him as a tyrant, a man who was out of control. But Ibrahim knew this was part of their strategy. Attack his character, spread lies, and hope that the people would turn against him. Yet the more they tried to discredit him, the more his popularity grew. The people of Burkina Faso were no longer fooled by the lies. They knew that Ibrahim was not the enemy. The real enemy was the system that had kept them oppressed for so long. The people were waking up, and no amount of media manipulation or foreign pressure could stop them. Now, one evening, Tiahaba's Ibrahim stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, overlooking the city. He was reminded of the journey that had brought him here. He had fought for this moment, not for power, but for the future of his people, for the future of Africa. And now, it seemed the entire continent was watching. Would Africa stand with him? Or would it fall back into the hands of the corrupt leaders who had stolen its future? As the sun set behind the city, Ibrahim knew that the road ahead would be difficult. But he was no longer fighting alone. The revolution had spread beyond Burkina Faso. It was now an African revolution, and the people would no longer accept the lies and manipulation of foreign powers. The battle was far from over, but Ibrahim Traoré was ready to see it through to the end. He had become the symbol of Africa's fight for dignity, and he would not be silenced. As the days stretched into weeks, the political climate grew increasingly tense. Burkina Faso's defiance against the African Union and foreign powers had set a precedent, but it was also making the country more vulnerable to economic and political attacks. The world was watching closely. Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, had refused to yield to the pressure of powerful nations, but there was still much to overcome. The EU's sanctions were tightening their grip, and the African Union's attempts to isolate him were relentless. Despite this, the people of Burkina Faso remained resolute. Their support for Ibrahim was unwavering, and with every obstacle, their resolve only grew stronger. Behind closed doors, Ibrahim's inner circle remained vigilant. The conspiracies against him continued to unfold. Ibrahim's security network had uncovered whispers of a planned coup, and tensions inside his own government were growing. Some of his closest allies, the very people who had helped him rise to power, began to show signs of doubt. The pressures from the West, the African Union, and even internal factions within Burkina Faso were beginning to take a toll. It was a dark day when Ibrahim received reports from his trusted military officers about a covert meeting between General Touré, a high-ranking officer, in his military and foreign agents. The general, who had been one of the earliest supporters of Ibrahim's leadership, was now suspected of plotting to overthrow him. Ibrahim was taken aback. His own ally, a man he had trusted, was conspiring against him. It was a devastating blow. But Ibrahim could not afford to be shaken. He knew that in times of revolution, betrayal was common. It was not just the enemy on the outside that sought to destroy him. It was the fear of change that often made people turn on their own. Ibrahim immediately called for a private meeting with General Touré. His thoughts raced as he prepared for the conversation. He didn't want to believe the worst about someone he considered a close ally, but the evidence was overwhelming. When Touré entered the room, Ibrahim stood, his face hardening. "What is this I hear about you conspiring with foreign agents?" Ibrahim asked, his voice calm, but filled with authority. Touré hesitated, his eyes flickering nervously. For a moment there was silence, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Finally Touré spoke, his voice trembling slightly. I never meant for things to get this far." Touré began. "The pressure from the West, the promises of wealth and power. It all became too much. They told me that if I didn't help, they would ruin everything. I was afraid, Ibrahim." Ibrahim's heart sank, but his anger remained under control. "Afraid? You've seen the people of this country rise with me. You've seen how the revolution is changing the lives of the people. How can you betray that? How can you betray your own people?" Touré lowered his head, unable to meet Ibrahim's eyes. "I'm sorry. I got caught up in the promises, but I never wanted to hurt you." Ibrahim took a deep breath, collecting himself. "It's not about me. It's about the people we swore to serve. You've let your fear take over, and now you're playing into the hands of those who want to see us fall. You've been used, General." The truth of the matter hit hard. Ibrahim knew that Touré wasn't the first to be tempted by power and promises. Many had fallen into the trap before, but now Touré's betrayal wasn't just about one man. It was a reflection of the larger battle for Africa's soul, a struggle between those who sought to preserve the corrupt systems that had kept Africa under foreign influence for decades, and those who fought for true freedom and sovereignty. Ibrahim made a decision. "General, you've betrayed the people of Burkina Faso, but I won't send you to prison. I will give you a chance to redeem yourself. Leave the country, go to Europe, where they think they can control us. You have a choice now to live with the knowledge that you chose wrong, or to help rebuild a nation that needs people of honor." Touré looked up, his eyes filled with shame, and nodded. "Thank you, President. I'm sorry for what I've done.